Hirano Village by James Worchester. Trey tightened his grip as the dropship began its descent through the atmosphere. Fire licked the windows, and vibrations rattled the cabin, but Trey didn't allow his mind to stray from their mission. He flipped down his visor to check the vitals of his squad. Heightened heart rates, but otherwise they were just praying, as usual. "Squad leaders," Jarek said from the front of the ship. "Report." Trey stood and made his way to the platoon leader alongside his fellow squad leaders. The dropship continued to rattle as it descended towards the planet's surface. "I just spoke with Lieutenant Cowlenth," Jarek said. "The High Prince's ship is in orbit. He'll be watching the action today." Trey fought to keep his face expressionless. The son of the Emperor was watching them? Some would have killed for that honor. Jarek nodded. "We have an opportunity to win the Prince's favor and grace today." He tapped his forearm to display a map of a small village rounded by a perimeter wall. "Hirano Village. This settlement is a known hotspot for rebel sentiment. Our mission is to eliminate the rebel presence and their sympathizers." Trey downloaded a map of the village to his personal display. The rebels were trying to subvert His Grace's guiding hand. They were risking the lives of their families with their heresy, but their sin went far beyond that. Separation from the Supreme Emperor's grace meant their very souls would be sentenced to eternal torment in the next life. Trey fought back a wave of nausea. He'd been trained as a drop trooper in His Majesty's Special Forces since he was 8 years old. He'd do whatever it took to enact his Lord's will. Jarek tapped his forearm again, deactivating the map. "One more thing. This planet has several colonies, but Hirano is the only one that's rebelling against His Grace. It's gone to war several times with a nearby colony named Tyner, a colony that's given us invaluable information on the location of several rebel hideouts inside Hirano. Be aware, be alert, and may His will be done." "May His will be done," Trey muttered, along with the other squad leaders. When Jarek dismissed them, Trey returned to his squad. Like Trey, each of them had been trained as drop troopers for the past 10 years. "Here we go," Trey said. "Grab your stuff and form up." They lined up by the door of the ship. It cracked open, letting in a blast of cool night air that swept around the cabin. Hirano Village lay before them under the shadow of a mountain that dominated the horizon. The otherwise dark village glowed with the orange light of a dozen fires. As the dropship descended, another bomber passed over the city, dropping a salvo of incendiary bombs across a block of houses. When the dropship hit the ground, Trey's training took over. His soldiers fanned out, each checking corners and rooftops for potential threats. His visor rotated a map into view, with a waypoint marked from Jarek. Trey made his way down a darkened city street, his 4 squadmates following close behind. His senses were overloaded with the sound of distant explosions and the smell of fire and napalm. He swept forward with his soldiers until he reached the location marked on his display. "Jarek," he said, "we're here. What are our orders?" "The block in front of you has over a dozen known rebels or rebel sympathizers," Jarek said. "Sweep the houses. Leave none alive. His Grace will know the innocent from the guilty at their judgment." A cold wave swept over Trey. Kill everyone? Surely the Supreme Emperor's mercy would lead them to a solution with less... "Trey, acknowledge your orders," Jarek said. Trey swallowed. "Acknowledged." He split up his squad and began breaching the houses. An old woman was inside the first, shielding 2 children. Trey grit his teeth, took a deep breath, and began shooting. Drop trooper visors came equipped with a setting that transformed each potential target into a featureless mannequin. Trey activated the setting as he left the woman's house. Killing for His Majesty brought him glory, so why was he choking back vomit? Trey continued down the street with his squad, killing everyone he found. When they reached the end of the street a half hour later, he paused. Flecks of blood from his victims stained his uniform. He shook his head. Victims? No. Blood from the rebel sympathizers. A 4-story building sat at the end of the street, taller than the others by 5 meters at least. A light flashed from a window near the top. "Trey, one of his soldiers shouted. Trey whipped his head around. Joni, one of his soldiers, convulsed violently on the ground. Trey immediately gave the order for a squad to fire at the tower. He knelt down by Joni, cradling his head. When Joni's convulsions stopped a few seconds later, he looked around, wide-eyed. "Joni?" Trey asked. "You okay?" "Where?" Joni said. "Where am I?" When he looked up at Trey, his face melted into a mixture of shock and horror. No. He struggled in Trey's grip, trying to push him away. "Get away from me!" Trey swung his fist into Joni's jaw. He went limp, the impact knocking the young man's helmet off. "Come on!" Trey shouted. He slung Joni over his shoulders and ran back down the street, away from the tower. His squad followed close behind. They moved deep into an alleyway. "What happened to Joni?" Roy, another one of his soldiers, asked. "I don't know," Trey said, keeping an eye on the mouth of the alleyway. "Get a reading of his vitals." He walked to the alley's opening, watching for movement with his rifle. Another flash of light came from the alley across the street. Trey jerked to the side, trying to avoid whatever had been fired at him. The motion yanked him out of a chair and onto the ground. "Trey?" a concerned voice asked. "You okay, honey?" Trey scrambled back. He was in a dining room. A man, woman, and young girl were sitting at a dinner table, each staring at him with concern. The smell of napalm and the sound of distant laser fire that had been overloading his senses just moments before were all missing. Trey scrambled for the sidearm at his waist and found nothing but a belt. He looked down to see he wore a sweater and pants instead of his drop trooper uniform. "What's going on?" he asked. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Breakfast?" She gestured to the eggs and pancakes on the table. "Where am I?" "Did you hit your head when you hit the floor?" the young girl asked. "What do you mean, where are you?" Trey got to his feet and ran for the door. He must have been knocked out and dragged away somehow. He crashed through the front door into the blinding sunlight outside. People milled around the street. Food vendors, men wearing business clothes, even a group of children apparently walking to school. There was no hint that any kind of battle had happened recently. Trey turned around. The same mountain that he'd seen from the dropship still dominated the horizon. "It's still Hirano Village," he muttered. He looked around, expecting rebels to arrest him at any instant. He'd be tortured, he knew. His drop trooper training had consisted of several simulated torture sessions. He wasn't arrested, though. In fact, no one seemed to be paying him any particular attention at all. Instead, the wind changed, wafting a delicious smell towards him from a food vendor further down the street. Trey paused for a moment before making his way to the vendor. The man sold some kind of fried dough that Trey had never seen before. "Mornin', son," the man said. 1 for 5, 2 for 8. Trey shook his head. "Where's the nearest space elevator?" The man's eyebrows knitted together. "Nearest space elevator. Well, it's a few light years away, I'd imagine." Trey shook his head. How is that possible? How else do your ships leave?" The man pursed his lips. "Well, our colony is still young. We still don't have any ships that can leave. I expect we won't escape our planet's gravity well for another few decades at least. Too much other work that needs doing first, I'm afraid. We do get the occasional supply drop from orbit, though, if you want something." "What about the Holy Empire? His Majesty? How do you—" Trey trailed off. The man shot Trey a sidelong glance. "Are you feeling all right, son? I'm not sure what you're talking about." Trey's jaw dropped. This man didn't... But His Majesty... Then the man's face fell. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, and he rested a hand on Trey's shoulder. "Did your family get caught up in the Tyna raid last week?" "I heard about that." He blew air out of his mouth. "No wonder you'd want to get off the planet with those savages prowling the plains around us. We'll find a way to pull through." Trey shook the man's hand off his shoulder, trying to process his words. Jarek had said something about a settlement called Tyner. There was a rivalry between the settlements. Maybe he could use that if it came down to... Something soft grabbed his hand. Trey spun away, dropping into a fighting stance, then straightened when he saw the young girl from breakfast. "Come on, Trey," the girl said. "You're freaking Mom and Dad out. What's going on?" Trey took a deep breath and shot a look at the mountain. The map he downloaded had marked the location of a few caves near its base. He walked towards it, leaving the confused girl behind. Trey dragged a thick cable along the floor of the cave, sticking it into his makeshift communicator. He wanted this transmission to have full power. It was only a lightspeed array, and that meant it'd take at least 7 years to reach the nearest planet in the Empire. That is, if any Empire planets even existed in this madness. Trey shook his head, wondering again if all the work he'd done over the past 3 months had been worthless. He still had no idea what was happening to him. The Empire would never let a planet secede, but somehow no one on this planet had heard of it. Trey was unsure if he was in a different timeline, different dimension, or just going crazy. He flipped a power switch and breathed a sigh of relief as the antennae swung into position. He sat at the console, taking a deep breath. He'd been thinking about the wording for this message for the past 2 months. The microphone buzzed when he spoke his public code word, then went silent when he flipped a switch to encrypt his message. Only the Holy Empire knew his private code word. They'd be able to decipher the rest easily enough if they got his message. "This is Squad Leader Trey," he said. "I am sending this message to any and all forces of the Holy Empire. I am stranded on a pagan planet, and am requesting immediate extraction and support." He continued, giving a brief description of his situation and living area. He flipped the machine off and sat back, breathing out a long sigh. 7 years. 7 years for the message to travel through space until it could reach the next planet under His Grace's hand. He'd have to wait at least that long for rescue, if it ever came. He sat back, staring at the roof of the cave. What should he do in the meantime? Maybe... "Trey?" A voice called out from the mouth of the cave. It was Brigitte, his little sister. Well, she apparently thought that she was his little sister, at least. Trey walked to the end of the cave and took the bag of food she offered. "Thanks," he said gruffly. She whipped her head up in surprise at the sound of his voice. "Trey?" Trey pointed to the bag. For the food, I mean. "Tell them I said thanks." "You can tell them yourself, you know. Mom is worried." Trey sighed and turned to walk back into his cave. He shouldn't have said anything. "They miss you," Brigitte called out. Her next words were softer. "I miss you." Trey waited inside until she left. When he was fairly sure she was gone, he returned to the mouth of the cave, sat down cross-legged, and began eating. The sun had set a half hour earlier, and the orange lights from the village were, he had to admit, beautiful. Trey's family was one of the more wealthy in Hirano. His father was the engineer in charge of their power grid, and one of the most educated men on the planet. At first, Trey had figured he'd need to start stealing supplies from the village to survive, but his family had begun delivering him supplies and food almost immediately after he'd established a camp in the cave. He took a massive bite of sandwich, letting his mind wander. It wandered back to his training as a drop trooper, his half-forgotten memories of early childhood, and each of the members of his squad. Joni, Varen, Roy. He missed them. Bizarrely, he also found his mind wandering to the pain he'd heard in Brigitte's voice earlier that afternoon. Why should he care if a girl he barely knew was upset? A pagan girl at that. He took a swig from a water bottle to wash down his sandwich. Then, all the orange lights in the village below flickered before going dark. He stood up, staring intently down at the village. Shrieks echoed up the mountain, so faint that Trey had to strain to make them out. He didn't have to strain to hear the laser fire, though. A military force was moving through the village. Trey had been trained to identify most weapons by sound alone. He couldn't place these at all, which meant they were either homemade or very heavily modified. Was this one of those Tyner raids he'd heard the locals discussing? Apparently, the Tyner settlement was failing, both with crops and with a lack of supplies. They'd begun raiding Hirano to steal materials and kidnap people. Trey tried to orient himself. Figures walked through the streets, getting closer to the house where his family lived. He jumped to his feet and started running down the hill. It would take him far too long to reach the village. He wasn't entirely sure why he was running to help them at all. The food, that's it, he told himself. If they're kidnapped, no one will feed me. With that lie firmly planted in his mind, he continued running down the slope and into the village. He was right. It had taken him far too long. He found his house with a broken front door and a destroyed kitchen. The Tyners had kidnapped his family. Trey set his jaw and stepped outside, spinning around at the sound of a hover bike moving down the street. A security officer pulled the bike to a stop in front of the broken door. The officer was in his late 40s and overweight. He jumped off the hoverbike and pulled a pistol out of a holster. He reached out and grabbed Trey's wrist. "What happened here? Is anyone—" Trey swung the top of his head into the officer's nose. The man crumpled to the ground without a whimper. Trey's motions were quick and precise. He pulled the laser pistol from the man's limp grip, inspecting it. It would do. He walked back into the house and stuck a kitchen knife into his waistband before pulling 2 extra pistol batteries from the unconscious man's belt. When he was done equipping himself, he swung up onto the hoverbike and revved it towards the village gate. The wind whipping past his face felt good. Almost as good as having another mission, another job, a clear goal of any kind. The Tyners had carved an easy-to-follow trail through the grassy plains to the southwest of the village. Trey throttled down his bike, forcing himself to plan. He'd want their raiding party to come to a stop for the night before he reached them. When his hoverbike crested the next hill, he was rewarded by a few lights out in the distance. They'd set up their camp. He settled his bike down onto the grass, making the rest of the way to the camp on foot. His strides through the grass calmed him, and the rough grip of the pistol in his hand was almost therapeutic. It took nearly half an hour of walking, but he reached the edge of the encampment. 2 men stood at the edge of the camp underneath a lantern. Trey shook his head at the mistake. Standing near a light when you were on guard duty was something only an amateur would do. It ruined your night vision, and did nothing more than tell anyone sneaking up on you exactly where you were. Trey crept up behind the larger of the 2 men. He was staring down at a tablet, oblivious. Trey dashed forward and stuck a knife between 2 ribs and twisted, widening the hole. The move did enough damage to partially deflate the man's lungs and make calling out for help almost impossible. He pulled the knife out and dashed towards the second man, who did nothing but stare with a confused expression. Trey jumped, bringing his knee up into the man's solar plexus and driving him to the ground. The air whooshed out of the man's lungs. He scrabbled uselessly at Trey's face until Trey pressed the edge of the knife against his throat. "Where are you keeping the people you kidnapped tonight?" Trey asked. The man fought for breath, his eyes wide. Trey grabbed a fistful of the man's long hair. "Tell me where you keep your prisoners, or I'll start cutting off your fingers. You have 10 seconds. The man coughed violently, then said, "There's a hover wagon. We only got like 2 families. They're still inside the wagon on the east side of the camp." "If you're lying, I'll come back for you." "I'm not lying," the man said. "Good," Trey said, slicing the man's throat before moving further into the camp. He found the hover wagon exactly where the man had said. It was large, with a makeshift cage in the back. Trey climbed up the back and hit the release button, revealing a dozen battered figures, his family amongst them. They stared up at him in shock and confusion. The left side of his dad's face was bruised and swollen. "Hey, guys," Trey said. "Wait here. I'll get you back home in just a minute." "How did you—" his mother asked. Trey cut her off by shutting the door of the wagon. Trey slid around to the cockpit, opened the door, and powered on the engine. He was worried that he'd have to shoot his way out, but he was wrong. The Tyner raiders may have been aggressive in their attack, but their lack of security made it clear that they'd grown complacent. He didn't see so much as a single guard as he drove back down the road and out of the camp. The next few hours crossing the grassy plains were stressful, but he reached Hirano Village before the sun rose. The next morning was a blur of people clapping him on the back, giving him gifts, and weepily thanking him for rescuing such and such and so and so. He felt uncomfortable. He had only done what he'd done, so he could keep eating. He kept telling himself that over and over, especially when he began to worry that he might smile. Trey dodged under a branch, with barely a break in his stride. Each day, he considered cutting the obstacle down, but he figured it gave him something to think about while on his daily run. To Trey's relief, the adulation and attention he'd received died down after a few weeks. He still spent most of his time in his makeshift hideout up on the mountainside, but he came down to the village every day for a run around the perimeter. His exercise routine was one of the few things from his former life that he held on to. Go for a run in the morning, practice martial arts in the afternoon, stare at the wall and do nothing, then repeat it all the next day. He picked up his pace, angry at himself. He was a drop trooper in His Majesty's army. He was better than this petty self-loathing. He was... A figure came into view, running along his path ahead of him. It was a girl, her hair pulled into a ponytail. Trey's pace was faster than hers, and he steadily closed the distance. When he reached her side, she picked up her pace to keep up. They ran together for 30 seconds or so before the girl fell back, puffing hard. Trey finished circling the village, then ran back up the mountain. The next day, he followed his routine again, and once again found the girl running along the track ahead of him. He once again pulled ahead of her, and she once again picked up her pace to stay alongside him. This repeated every day for the next 2 weeks, with neither Trey nor the girl acknowledging the other. The girl consistently improved. Each day she kept up for longer than the last, and soon Trey spent significant portions of his run with her beside him. One morning, Trey reached his starting line and found the girl stretching her legs, apparently waiting for him. Trey, once again, said nothing and started his run. She fell into place alongside him, keeping pace for the majority of the run. They were just a few minutes from the end when she began falling behind. "Push through it," Trey said. "Come on." Her eyes widened in surprise, and she picked up her pace again. They rounded the last corner and finished the run together. The girl stumbled to a stop, leaning against a tree and breathing hard. "Don't sit down, you'll get a cramp," Trey said. "Too late for that," she said through gritted teeth. "Walk around with your hands on your lower back. It'll help," Trey said. The girl gave a grunt, pacing back and forth. She looked to be 17 or 18, athletic, and wore her dark brown hair in a ponytail. Trey was suddenly aware that he'd been staring at her for too long and looked away. "What's your name?" he asked, still looking into the distance. "Jane," she said. "I'd ask, but I already know yours." Trey wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, he asked the question that had been on his mind since their very first run together. "Why'd you start running with me?" She looked at him for a long moment before sighing. "Do you remember that attack a year ago, when the Tyners made that huge raid against Hirano Village? They only wanted to kidnap one of our doctors, but they killed a whole lot of people during the attack. My brother was one of them." Trey said nothing. "I don't know how you learned to do what you did," Jane said, staring at Trey's hands as if they held some secret. "But I started watching your training around here and up there." She gestured to the mountain. She shook her head. "You heard that your family got kidnapped, then rode out across the plains on a stolen hoverbike, like something out of a vid." She walked up to him, never breaking eye contact. Her eyes were a quite remarkable shade of blue. "I want to learn how to do that. I want to make Hirano Village safe. I want no one to ever fear the raiders again. And I think you can show me how." Trey looked away. He wanted to say yes desperately. Would it be a betrayal of the Empire to teach this girl? Would he be court-martialed if he taught her battlefield tactics? What if she became a rebel? He clenched his fists. It was too great a risk. His Majesty would certainly want Trey to turn her away and continue training by himself. Fine, Trey said. Our training starts tomorrow. Trey grunted, pulling himself up over the ledge with a burst of effort. When he was safely above, he took off his pack and rubbed at his sore fingers. They were only halfway up the peak, but he'd already earned a half-dozen scrapes and bruises. Okay, he shouted, jerking the rope wrapped around his waist twice. Jane reached the ledge a few minutes later. They waited there for a moment, drinking water and stretching. If this thing doesn't work, Trey said, nudging the pack with his foot, I am going to launch myself off this mountain head first. Well, Orrin would never stop talking about it, so I'd be slow to judge you, Jane said. Just do me a favor and make sure you take off the rope before you make the leap. Uh-huh, Trey said, taking another swig from his bottle. The sensor array he carried in his backpack would be able to, in theory, scan for 12 miles all around Hirano Village. That would result in precious advanced warning during the next Tyner attack. For the sensor to work as intended, it needed to be installed at the top of the mountain. He and Jane had been planning this expedition for the better part of a month. Trey shot another look up at the still distant peak. It was cast in an orange light from the setting sun. He and Jane had planned out 2 days to make the treacherous climb. Trey was supposed to carry the heavy sensor array, while Jane carried the camping supplies that they'd need to spend the night on the summit. Trey stuffed his bottle into his pack before slinging it over his back. Ready? Jane raised an eyebrow. Do you just never get tired? It's like I'm climbing alongside a machine. She got to her feet, stretched her hands, and began climbing the wall. Trey waited at the ledge, bracing his back against the cliff in case she fell. Like a machine, he thought. He'd wanted to be like a machine for most of his life. Machines were good at following orders. Machines did as they were told. Machines didn't get sick to their stomachs when they killed rebels or sympathizers. His Majesty worked well with machines. Trey shot a look up at Jane. She swung her leg up on a rock outcropping and paused, looking down at him. I can tell you're staring at my butt, she called out. Trey looked away, trying to hide a grin from his now reddening face. He didn't think he wanted to be like a machine anymore. When they finally summited the mountain, the sky was a blue so dark that it was almost indistinguishable from black. Trey stuffed the sensor array in a crevice, then helped Jane nail their tent into the rocks. When that was done, they pulled out a few sandwiches and ate in companionable silence, overlooking the view. Both of the moons in the sky were crescents, but they were bright enough to cast the plains surrounding Hirano Village in a pale white light. Huge waves of grass rippled in waves from the breeze. Trey gave a quiet laugh. What? Jane asked. I don't know, Trey said honestly, looking over at her. I don't know. She was watching him intently. What? He asked, repeating her question. Who are you? She asked. Trey looked away. I talked to your parents, she said, her voice soft. They told me you came here with them when you were 5 years old. How does a colony kid growing up in Hirano learn military tactics? How do you know martial arts? How did you know how to sneak up on the raiders? You really just taught yourself all that? I didn't. Jane scooted towards him, her eyes eager. But you're what, 19? It's like you're a lanky teenager mixed with some commando from an action vid. It's hard for me to explain. Jane gestured to the view, then to the tent. We've got plenty of time. Trey's words began pouring out slowly, then faster and faster, until he was speaking before he could think. I didn't come here when I was 5. I showed up here around 2 years ago. I grew up as a soldier in His Majesty's Imperial Drop Force. I was a drop trooper for the Eternal Empire, fighting for His Majesty's will. Everything I've taught you, everything I know, I learned it there. I don't really understand what that means, Jane said, her eyes searching for any hint that he was kidding. So your parents lied to cover for you then? No, they think I came here with them. And they have pictures of me when I was 5 and 10 and 15. Trey grabbed at his shirt. This body is their son's. but it's also somehow the same one that I've always had. I don't understand, so I don't expect you to. Jane looked out over the plain, her eyebrows knitting together. That's very weird, Trey. I'm aware. Their conversation lapsed into an awkward silence. After a few minutes, Jane shook her head. I'm cold. How about you? I'm fine. I think there might be an insulated blanket in the tent if you want to grab it. Right, she said. Trey was suddenly aware of how close she was. He scooted away to give her more space. Jane sighed. You know, for a drop soldier trooper in the Super Mega Ultra Empire Secret Special Forces, you're pretty dumb about some things, she said. Trey frowned. What do you... I can tell you like me, you know. Trey froze. What do you... I mean, I've never seen you staring at Oren the way you stare at me. Or am I wrong? Trey opened and closed his mouth, not saying anything. His drop trooper training had taken place in an all-male academy. The only women he interacted with were his hyper-conservatively dressed instructors, or during simulations, where, occasionally, the enemy soldiers would be women. Jane sighed. Put your arm around me. Trey froze. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he stretched his arm out, placing his elbow around the back of her neck. Jane snorted, grabbing his hand and putting it at her waist, scooting closer and shaking her head in disbelief. You really weren't making a move when you suggested this trip, were you? She wasn't cold at all. She was marvelously warm. Making a what? Trey asked, his mind racing. She gave a clear, cool laugh that reminded him of wind on a summer night. It'll probably take 2 days to get up the mountain to set up the scanner, she said, doing an impersonation of his voice. We should probably plan on spending at least one night up there. She shook her head and laughed again. Here I thought it was your way of making a move. Trey didn't have the faintest idea what making a move even meant. He lifted his hand from her waist, afraid that he defended her somehow. She snatched it out of the air and pulled it back into place. Well, she said, I guess this whole mentorship thing might go both ways. Trey revved his hovercycle, launching over a tall, grassy hill. He grinned as a pair of small hands tightened around his waist. He angled the cycle, hitting on the far side of a hill, at a shallow angle. That was too fast, the voice came from behind him. Next one, go slower. Trey grinned and continued to carve back and forth along the hillside. A shrill shriek of excitement accompanied his next launch off a hill. Dad, I'm hungry, the voice said. Okay, we'll head back, Trey said, angling back towards Hirano Village. Let's see if we can convince Mom to eat out tonight. Yeah! Trey shot a look back at his daughter. Riley had Jane's blue eyes and Trey's tan complexion. He shot her a grin and gunned the cycle, driving them towards the next hill. The communicator on a cycle chirped. He slowed the cycle to a stop and answered it. Just who I hope to see, he said. Riley and I were hoping to go out to... We've got movement on the border, Jane said, her voice tense. Trey's face tightened. How far out? They'll be here in an hour. I'll be there in 15. Gather everyone. Already on it. Trey gunned the cycle back to the village, stopping to drop Riley off at Jane's parents' house. Then he rode to the small armory they'd been developing. Around 30 men and women were readying weapons. They straightened as he approached. He gave a hard look at their weapons and armor before nodding and grabbing his own gear. Sir, what's the plan? A young man asked. He was clearly terrified. Trey set a reassuring hand on his shoulder. That's what I'm here to find out. Where's Jane? The man pointed towards another room. Trey entered to find Jane staring down at a holomap, displaying nearly 300 Tyner raiders streaking across the plains. She pointed out several vehicles and marked the section of wall they were likely to attack. Jane looked up at him and gave a humorless smile. I told you that sensor array would work. She looked around. Where's Riley? At your parents'. She nodded. Good. They moved back into the armory, where their ragtag security force waited for them. Trey realized, with a start, that they were all watching him. He'd been training them for the better part of 6 years, and had naturally slipped back into his role as squad leader. Though, he thought, with over 30 soldiers in my command, I'm more like Jarek. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, then began to speak. They'll have more numbers than us. So we'll spread out to give the impression that we've got more people than we actually do. Tyners are cowards. If they sense we're not easy prey, they'll back away." He looked around at the men and women under his command. "We have a job to do," he said. "Our families and friends are depending on us to protect them. Our own lives are nothing compared to them. Trey trailed off. "My religion says that there's someone who knows better. I know that if he were here, he'd give us his blessing. May his will..." Trey cut himself off with a shake of the head. "May our will be done. Let's go." They moved out to the village walls as night fell, each set up a few dozen feet from the other. Fighting broke out a half hour later and lasted for the better part of the night. The raiders broke against the wall like waves against a rocky shore. They had somehow managed to build explosives that they lobbed at the walls with primitive launchers. Luckily, the weapons were terribly inaccurate. Trey managed to shoot one of the launchers while it passed an ammo truck, resulting in a massive explosion that killed a dozen raiders. When the sun finally rose the next morning, 8 of Trey's soldiers were dead, alongside more than 80 enemy combatants. Hundreds of spent energy cells littered the ground around Trey, filling the air with the familiar tang of ozone. Trey was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, but he refused to leave his overwatch position on the wall until the word came that the surviving Tyners had moved out of sensor range. When a medic finally applied a nerve-blocking spray to the nubs, Trey nearly passed out from the relief. He made his way down the wall, struggling to keep his footing. His eyes burned from the night vision goggles he'd been wearing, and his hair stunk. He ran a hand through it, feeling a crunch that meant it must have been on fire at some point earlier that night, though Trey had no memory of it. Even in his delirious state, it was impossible to escape the eyes of his soldiers and the civilians. They were watching him with the same reverence they'd watch an approaching storm. "I watched him," one shouted to another on Trey's right. "He must have killed 50 of them by himself." Trey didn't care. He left them behind and made his way to his house. It wasn't until he saw Riley safe that he could finally sleep. Trey's hand ached, like it always did. He rubbed at the stumps where once, 15 years ago, he'd lost his fingers in a battle. It was a habit he could never shake. Jane reached over and grabbed his good hand. "You ready?" she asked. "Of course not," Trey said, brushing his suit. "Is any father ever really ready?" "I suppose not. My dad certainly didn't approve of you," Jane said. "I'm glad he eventually came around." Riley turned the corner in her wedding dress. She took Trey's extended elbow and pulled through the door. Hundreds of guests sat in the pews filling the hall. Trey figured that most were probably there for Jane and him instead of his daughter, but that was the way of things. Here, in another 20 years, he'd be all but forgotten, and his daughter would be the one well known in town. That's what he told himself, at least. He came to a stop before the altar, where his daughter's fiancé waited. Trey gave her a hug and returned to Jane at the back of the church. "What are you thinking?" Jane asked. "I'm a lucky man," Trey said. "Very, very lucky." Something hard hit the back of Trey's head. The air reeked of ozone and blood. And he was somehow lying on his back. Had he tripped? Suffered a stroke, like Orin? 4 soldiers stood over him, each holding Imperial-issued weapons. Trey reached to the back of his head to check for blood, and felt the cool metal of a helmet. He sat up, looking around in complete confusion. "Suppressive fire!" Roy shouted. Trey wasn't sure how he knew that the soldier's name was Roy. That didn't make any sense. None of Hirano's soldiers had that name. Then he truly looked around. He was near his in-laws' house, but in some alternate hellish reality. Half of the buildings were burnt down or in shambles. Trey jerked to his feet, shocked at the coordination and force in his limbs. He held up his left hand, examining the fingers he'd been missing for the better part of 2 decades. "Jane," he whispered. One of his soldiers ran up to him. "Sir, you had a seizure like Junie. Are you..." Trey snapped his head and barked orders. "Squad, form up on me." "But, sir, Junie is still unconscious." "Now." He turned and ran down the street, away from the flames, struggling to ignore the still wet blood spattering his uniform. There it was, sitting on the corner, his in-laws' house. The door was still hanging open. He remembered kicking it, somehow both half an hour and a lifetime ago. There were 3 generic mannequins laying inside. Trey ripped off his helmet and knelt down. He was vaguely aware that Jarek's voice was shouting orders through his helmet speaker. Jane lay in a pool of blood in the kitchen, near where he'd had dinner dozens of times. She was the Jane of his memories, the 17-year-old he'd gone running with so many years ago. He picked up her body, held her close, and began to sob. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed my writing, please consider subscribing, or becoming a Patreon subscriber. I'd like to give a special thanks to my Patreon backers, Brooke Tang, Private Castle, Lilith Scyther, Peter Jameson, Madman611, Lily Bain, Vivian Hoy, Claire Shabir, Hassan Miranda, May Madeline Budd, Lauren Ashley, Luna Vaughn, Stephanie Jennings, Kristen Molina, Carter B., Yaz Legister, Oopie Spoopy Man, AJ, Christina, and my newest Patreon backer, Noodle Schmoodle. Your support is truly invaluable. Thank you.